From the mid to the late 19th century, there was no more glittering European capital than the center of the Habsburg Empire, Vienna, the city of dreams. Its very name conjures up images of imposing palaces, rich coffee with whipped cream, broad boulevards dotted with horse-drawn carriages, effervescent flutes of champagne, and masked balls at midnight. These images were created through the confluence of a growing middle class and hedonistic society, and the golden age of the Habsburgs, the most prosperous royal family in Europe. This atmosphere was perfect for the growth of the entertainment industry, such as it was, and in the midst of this, the need for entertaining music, salon music, party music, dance music, and of course, theater music. It's fascinating that the production of virtually all of this occasional music ended up falling into the hands of a single family of musicians, the Strauss family, who had no fewer than 6 members involved in the perpetuation of a musical dynasty that lasted from the 1850s to the 1960s. The most prominent of these were the 2 Johanns, Johann the Elder, who was the first Strauss to be called the Waltz King, and his eldest son, Johann, who single-handedly devised and codified what we now know as the Viennese waltz. This was the Strauss who gave us Tales of the Vienna Woods, Wine, Women, and Song, and On the Beautiful Blue Danube. The younger Johann Strauss would have gone into the music history books for only having created these shimmering masterworks, but for one other thing. He took what was once an essentially French theatrical form, imbued it with an Austrian lilt, and created the Viennese operetta, an entertainment that audiences all over the world began to clamor for after the premiere of his most beloved work, the charming, hilarious, satirical comedy Die Fledermaus, the champagne of Viennese operettas. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. Although today we think of the operetta as being something specifically Viennese, it wasn't always that way. The origins of this light, comic, and often satirical theater piece with sung numbers and spoken dialogue are to be found in the Paris of the 1850s. There, the composer Jacques Offenbach was having great success with short one-act comedies that sent up the social mores and pomposities of the day. After opening the Théâtre des Bouffes Parisiens in 1855, he found his theater stormed night after night by citizens starving for evenings of light musical entertainment. In the audience's mind, the place where they used to go for such fare, the opéra comique, was getting far too serious and far too pretentious for its own good, and Offenbach seemed to hit on a formula that bred success. The problem was that these little pieces didn't have a lot of staying power, and he was writing an average of 8 of these per year. But soon he was writing full-length satirical comic operas that he called opéra bouffe, or comic opera. Now both Offenbach and his little masterpieces traveled all through Europe, and it wasn't too long before his works were also the center of attention in the considerable theatrical world of Vienna. His works appeared in Bowdlerized editions, certainly, but also under his own considerable authority, with the composer at the conductor's desk. These productions in turn stimulated interest among local composers to create their own Viennese versions of these frothy comedies. Franz von Suppe was one of the first Austrian composers to try his hand at an authentically Viennese operetta, and his 1860 work, Das Pensionat, is usually considered the first example of the form. But it wasn't until 1871 that the Viennese operetta found its most natural, colloquial expression in the music of Johann Strauss the Younger. Born in 1825 to the original Waltz King, the young Johann was the eldest of 6 children. His father didn't want him to go into music, intending instead that the boy go into banking of all things. But the child, under the watchful eye of his mother, took violin and theory lessons secretly until 1842, when his father separated from his mother and took up with a younger woman. After this, the young Johann took formal musical instruction and eventually wound up establishing himself with his own orchestra. It wasn't long before he was his father's only rival in the composition and performance of dance music, especially the waltz. With the popularity of the comic operas of Jacques Offenbach in Vienna, it was almost as if a challenge had been given to all Austrian composers. And when the performing committee of the Theater an der Wien approached Strauss to compose for the stage, he took to the form naturally and quickly. His first two operettas, while somewhat successful, didn't quite overtake the French imports in popularity. But with the composition of Die Fledermaus, Offenbach's witty opera bouffe were soon forgotten, and Viennese operetta was born. Now, like the creation of many great works of the theater, there's a lot of mythology around the composition of Die Fledermaus, but I'll try to do my best to give you the straight facts. We do know that Jacques Offenbach, during one of his many visits to Vienna, and already a great admirer of Strauss, told his fellow composer that his musical style could easily be adapted to the stage. Strauss was flattered, but not entirely convinced. He was probably more convinced by virtue of the fact that Franz von Suppe and other lesser composers were trying their hand at this new comic opera form called operetta. But it was Strauss's wife, the singer Yetish Trefts, who tipped the scales by secretly having words set to some of his waltzes and giving them to the director of the Theater an der Wien, Max Steiner. The Theater an der Wien played a major role in the development of German opera. Both Mozart's The Magic Flute and Beethoven's Fidelio were premiered there, and later in 1905, another great Viennese operetta had its premiere in the same house, Franz Lehar's The Merry Widow. Steiner was a canny producer, and sensing the financial potential of stage works from the pen of Vienna's most popular composer, he did his best to partner Strauss with librettists worthy of his stature. It wasn't until Steiner offered Strauss a libretto that had been discarded by Offenbach that he found the inspiration to begin Die Fledermaus. This libretto was written by Offenbach's official French librettists, Henri Meillac and Ludovic Halévy, originally entitled Les Réveillons. Steiner handed the French original over to Richard Genet, an experienced man of the theater, whose manipulation of the material made the story more authentically Viennese. According to legend, Strauss, fired up by the strength of the material, wrote steadily for 43 days, neglecting food and sleep until the work was finished. We now know that this is probably a fabrication. The work was certainly blocked out within a 6-week period, but it actually took 6 months before the work finally hit the stage in April 1874. Fledermaus was an early stage work of Strauss. He ended up writing 14 more operettas before his death in 1899, including The Gypsy Baron and A Night in Venice. But he's remembered today as the composer of Fledermaus, an irresistibly elegant, stylishly melodic, effervescent piece that never fails to succeed with an audience. Although Die Fledermaus is a relatively short 3 acts, being a comedy of mistaken identities, it becomes quite complicated, but let's give it a try. We're in the home of the wealthy Viennese banker Gabriel von Eisenstein and his wife, Rosalinda. The first thing we hear is a young man serenading Rosalinda from the street. Adela, the Eisenstein's maid, comes in reading a letter from her sister, inviting her to come to a party that evening at the home of the wealthy Prince Orlovsky, an eccentric aristocrat. When Rosalinda arrives, Adela pretends that she has a sick aunt and asks for the evening off to attend to her needs, but Rosalinda refuses. Her husband Eisenstein must begin a 5-day jail sentence tonight for fighting with a policeman, and she doesn't want to be left alone. Adela leaves, but Rosalinda is soon visited by Alfred, the young singer who was serenading her out on the street. She can't believe the nerve of the man, boldly entering the house of a married woman like this, and she insists that he leave, and he does, but makes her promise to let him in while her husband is in jail. After Alfred leaves, Eisenstein arrives with his attorney, Dr. Blind. Dr. Falke, a friend of Eisenstein, also arrives and secretly invites him to that same Orlovsky ball. He can begin his jail sentence tomorrow morning after a night of celebration. In the meantime, Rosalinda, wanting now to be alone with her suitor, tells the maid Adela that she can go to visit her sick aunt. The table has been set for Rosalinda and her husband to have their final meal together, but Eisenstein has left, and in comes Alfred, the singing suitor. He begins to woo her, but they are interrupted by Frank, the jailer, who has come to collect Eisenstein. Caught in a compromising position, Rosalinda passes the young suitor Alfred off as her husband, and off he goes to jail. In the second act, we find ourselves at Prince Orlovsky's masked ball, and everyone has arrived in disguise. Adela, the maid, is disguised as the actress Mademoiselle Olga. Eisenstein is announced as the Marquis Renard. The jailer Frank is the Chevalier Chagrin, and Rosalinda arrives in the role of a Hungarian countess. In the midst of the party, Eisenstein recognizes his Adela in one of Rosalinda's evening gowns, and Rosalinda oversees him flirting with the maid. Falke reins her in from revealing herself, but encourages her to present herself to her husband as an object of flirtation. You see, Dr. Falke is out for revenge. 3 years ago, Falke, dressed from head to toe in a ridiculous bat costume, in other words, Die Fledermaus, had gone to a costume ball with Eisenstein and gotten terribly drunk. Eisenstein abandoned him in a public park where he passed out and then awoke the next morning to all of the citizens of Vienna laughing at him and calling him Dr. Bat, Dr. Fledermaus. As the party goes on and everyone gets happier with champagne, Eisenstein gets closer and closer to unmasking the flirtatious, mysterious Hungarian countess who is actually his own wife. But suddenly, the clock strikes 6, he must go to jail and begin his sentence. So what happens in the final act? What will Eisenstein think when he arrives at the jail and discovers his wife's young suitor, Alfred, there in his place? Will Rosalinda jeopardize her marriage by admitting her innocent tete-a-tete with Alfred? Will Dr. Falke exact his revenge? Well, you won't get the answers from me. You'll have to see the opera. Well, let's explore a little bit more this topic of Die Fledermaus by Johann Strauss with my friend Jack Montgomery, the artistic director of Lyric Opera San Diego. Jack, welcome.
Nice to be here.
I know last year your company did Die Fledermaus,
yes,
and the San Diego opera production is going to feature you as Frosch.
Oh, now, feature, but I'm going to be in it, that's for sure.
We didn't, I mean, Frosch is in the third act of Die Fledermaus. He's the jailer and is always played by a comic actor. This is a wonderful, I guess, long tradition in the Viennese opera and certainly in the tradition of doing Die Fledermaus. But I want you to talk a little bit more about this character. I didn't even mention him in the synopsis because he's not integral to the plot.
Well, he's not integral to the plot as it stands right now, but in the original production, Frosch actually appears in all 3 acts. He does a little prologue right after the first little song that Alfred sings and interrupts the action. He's looking for his dog, and he talks about all the stuff and sets up what the practical joke is and why the revenge, because the doctor was dressed as the bat.
Did the creators feel that this was necessary for exposition?
It has something to do with the French tradition of Offenbach and that opera bouffe routine where you were trying to make it very topical and also where you were making the theater action of it a part of what was, because he stops the action. It's very surreal. When we produced it last year, I restored this. Nicolas Reveles had done it in Graz, Austria, where I have been a teacher at Ames, and the people in in Graz were outraged that Frosch would rear his head in the first two acts. But in the original version, it's very kind of theater of the absurd. It's right out of UNESCO. He talks to the audience. He says, in the second act, when he comes in the ballroom scene, he says to the audience, do any of you understand what's going on? I mean, it's all this very kind of wonderful theater of the absurd moment inserted in this. Now, the original production had a tiny little bit of rockiness. It wasn't the kind of huge hit that they intended it to be.
Right.
And the woman who was the directress of the Theater an der Wien was the Rosalinda, and of course she did not like the idea that the big comic was getting all this laughs in the other two acts, stealing the show.
Right.
So she suggested that the judicious cutting of Frosch might be a good thing.
So
he ended up on the cutting room floor in history. But Frosch is always one of those characters that's an actor that comes from outside of whatever the usual company is. And there's a long tradition in America of it at the Metropolitan Opera with people like Dom DeLuise and Sid Caesar and Walter Slezak being people who would come in and do this as a kind of a star turn to begin the third act.
What are some of the other traditions that exist in Viennese operetta generally that Die Fledermaus perhaps began, or Die Fledermaus
Well,
canonized?
one of the things that it canonized is the role of Orlovsky as a pants role. The fact that there was a mezzo that was a pretty girl that was able to be seen was very much something that the middle-class audiences of Vienna relished. And it became very much a fixture of the golden age of operetta as a direct result of Fledermaus.
What was that all about? I mean, was it a sly sexual joke?
It is a sly sexual joke. It also was in the original production. He is dressed in an 18th century livery so that his legs showed, which was very much the reason that pants roles were done, was so that you would see that lovely feminine leg, which was considered to be quite sexual and also a little bit risque. And that was a part, and of course because he was playing a little boy, it was not that unusual as far as a reason to be dressed in that way. The other thing is that there is, a couple of years ago in Vienna, there was a wonderful retrospective of Johann Strauss. And in that display, there was a long description of something that is being recorded in Orlovsky, that it was actually based on a real Russian prince who was the heir to a railroad fortune, whose parents were killed in an accident. And at the ripe old age of 13, he inherited these millions of rubles and went from capital to capital in Europe and was run out because his life was too wild. All those champagne baths with the ballet girls that they're talking about in the second act. And also lowering the tone of the neighborhood by having the ambassadorial staffs invited so that you had all these exotic people at the party as well, which is what the second act is really celebrating as a part of what was going on. And the original librettists were aware of that. And when they wrote the play in France, they had their tongues in their cheeks about that because he had been run out of Paris because of this hijinks.
So all of the comedy, all of the humor had to be very of the moment. Very contemporaneous.
And the other thing is that Fledermaus is a place where the acting of the comedy becomes so much involved with the characters, and the character of that is in the music. And that the fact that Strauss was able to capture that character so well and ask actors to really be singing actors as a part of what the tradition is a reason why only the very most facile performers can have a success in it, because it is a real challenge to sing that hard and then to be believable and funny as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jack. I appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
That's the famous waltz featured in the overture to Die Fledermaus. It perfectly captures the spirit of the entire score, because virtually every note of this operetta is inspired by the rhythms of the dances which were wildly popular all over Europe in 1874. Although we think of Strauss as the waltz king, he was just as prolific in the composition of other dances like the polka and the gallop or the can-can. The polka, a Bohemian dance introduced in Prague in 1837, became so popular that the term polka mania was coined to describe the phenomenon. And in fact, there are almost as many polkas in Die Fledermaus as there are waltzes. Here is an example, a polka that first appears in the overture and then in a trio for the characters Rosalinda, Adela, and Eisenstein in Act 1. A polka also appears early in Act 1 as Adela reads the letter from her sister inviting her to Prince Orlovsky's party. But it's the lilt of the Viennese waltz that gives Die Fledermaus its soul, and each waltz is fabricated by the composer to match the sentiments of the text and the story exactly. Here, Alfred invites Rosalinda to drink away their cares as he attempts to seduce her with a waltz. In Act 2, the disguised Eisenstein approaches the similarly disguised Adela, absolutely sure that this woman is indeed Adela, his wife's maid. But she puts him off with a waltz. What else? But listen to the character of this waltz, introduced by Dr. Falke at the climax of the ball to toast brotherhood and love. Suddenly we realize that the waltz is capable of being both melancholy and wistful. But then, of course, we have the sparkling exuberance of the Fledermaus waltz itself, first heard in the overture, but then again as the culmination of the masked ball at the end of Act 2. The score is infectious. The tunes and rhythms seep into your very soul and carry you away. That is, of course, what they hoped in 1874 at the Theater an der Wien when Die Fledermaus premiered. The Black Friday stock exchange crash had occurred the year before in 1873. The imperial house of Habsburg was beginning to crumble, and already the elements that would bring about the First World War were appearing as microscopic tears in the glittering fabric that was Vienna. What do you do in the face of all that? Dance, my dear, just dance. Surely Surely Die Fledermaus is one of the easiest musical works for the stage to listen to, and there's certainly no problem understanding the music and accepting it as part of an immensely entertaining evening. But this operetta does have its subtleties, and a good recorded performance will not only help you get in the mood for experiencing the piece live, but will be a wonderful keepsake as well. Here are some of my favorites. This recording on Teldec features Edita Gruberova in the role of Rosalinda, Barbara Bonney as Adela, Werner Holweg as Eisenstein, and Anton Scharinger as Dr. Folke. It's an interesting performance by the Concertgebouw Orchestra conducted by Nicholas Harnoncourt from original manuscript sources of the work. Here's an extremely successful performance featuring the Vienna Philharmonic and soloists Kiri Tekanoa, again Edita Gruberova, Brigitte Fassbender, Wolfgang Brendel, and Richard Leach, all under the baton of André Previn. This is a wonderfully idiomatic performance. But my all-time favorite recording of Die Fledermaus is this one, with Anneliese Rothenberger, Nikolai Gedda, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, Renata Holm, and Brigitte Fassbender, with the Vienna Symphony all under the direction of the incomparable Willy Boskowski, who was the reigning Viennese interpreter of Strauss in the 20th century. This is a scintillating performance that I know you'll enjoy. On DVD, we have this delightful performance from Glyndebourne Opera, under the direction of Vladimir Yurovsky, starring Pamela Armstrong and baritone Thomas Allen. Out of all these resources, I'm sure you'll find something to whet your appetite to see this delightful operetta in the theater. While Strauss's later works, The Gypsy Baron and Wiener Blut, are often considered as great as Die Fledermaus, they haven't quite captured the public in the same way. There's something about the infectious dance rhythms, the cockeyed story, and the character's willingness to blame everything on the champagne that makes audiences want to see it again and again. It's been translated into numerous languages. Its story has been revised, updated, and deconstructed, and gala performances have offered surprise guests in that second act ball scene, from Luciano Pavarotti to your Aunt Tilly, but the work is virtually indestructible. Die Fledermaus guarantees a great evening of hummable tunes and generous amounts of comedy, making it one of the most delightful stage pieces ever written. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.